Welcome to The Hidden Truth, Breaking the Silence. I'm your host, Jonathan McLernan. Each episode we explore stories of individuals and how they've been affected by being a part of a secretive Christian fellowship. The stories shared here may include speaking about sensitive topics suited for a mature audience. Dysfunction happens when doctrine meets dogma and silence is paramount. So let's pull back the veil on today's episode of The Hidden Truth. All right, welcome back to the show. I am always excited. And again, it seems weird to say that I'm excited when I get to talk to somebody about some of the things we're going to talk about today, but I'm excited because what it really means is this is a positive movement that is affecting people's lives in a way that should have been happening many, many years ago, but it's taken whatever has happened in the last year to bring this to fruition. And so today we're going to talk with Rohs and about her work with Advocates for the Truth and her experience as well. So Lauren, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So kind of before we dive into that, what is your connection to the fellowship?
Yeah, so on my maternal side, my great-great-grandparents found meetings in the hills of Colorado on their honeymoon in the 20s. And so they spent their honeymoon reading the Bible, and that was sort of that's the abridged version, shortened version of the story. But basically, I come from family in California and Arizona that are very, very highly regarded amongst the community, especially my maternal side, like very high values. You know, they dress, speak appropriately, are very well liked, etc. On my paternal side, it's interesting because in the paternal side, the women are actually educated, which is kind of rare, at least because my maternal side, no one went to college, all of that. So I very much grew up with my mother being like, you know, you're going to be either a wife or a worker. And those are the two paths in life. My grandmother is actually an amazing pianist. And so I started taking piano lessons, and that was kind of my escape from normal life. I could, play classical music and that kind of thing. And so I was allowed to play hymns, all of that. But we went to everything. We went to gospel meetings. We'd drive hours. If there was a meeting in another place, we'd have workers' meetings at our homes. We'd have gospel meetings. We would go to every convention we could for holidays. Like that's the house that I grew up in. And having a father who was a worker also sort of meant he was a little bit of like I don't know if calling him a celebrity is the proper word, but he sort of was like well known, and he always spoke longer than everyone else in the meetings. And so he was just one of those figures, So I grew up, it's like, you have Bible study before you go to school, and you don't play the piano on Sundays, just that kind of stuff. So very much very much grew in that kind of up in that kind of environment.
Right. So you were like deeply, deeply steeped in this kind of stuff. Like, wow. I mean, admittedly, my mind, when you said about your great grandparents, like finding it in the hills of Colorado, I was like, wow, I feel like I'm trying to picture what it would be like. It's hard to imagine a world without the internet, maybe without even phones and things like that. And you encounter like these, I think back then they might even call them like these tramp preachers, talking about the gospel. And it would have been like a totally novel experience based on like prior history, which was like you go to a church, you have a preacher, and so on, and you meet this, and it'd be like, whoa, this is different.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I mean that, and I think from both maternal and paternal sides, it's like a lot of like agrarian agriculture type families where they were in the middle of nowhere and they didn't have anything, and so when this happened or when this came to them, it was like, oh wow, it's a lot of it like the Great Depression era. So for them, it was sort of meaningful because it's like, oh, it's free. I can attend for free. I could read the Bible.
Oh, yeah.
There's a sense of like community, like potlucks, all of that stuff. And so it became my maternal family really very much became like one of the families of Southern California that was very well known for like hosting young people's get-togethers and all of those types of things. They're sort of like, good stock, I guess you could say.
I don't want to say I was the opposite, but like we lived in a small town where there weren't a lot of friends, so we didn't actually get nearly as much socialization in amongst professing young people as probably others in like the cities would have. And I didn't even have any real friends in the meetings like growing up
Mm.
per se. I had people that I knew that I could sort of shake hands with. But, oh man, I remember gospel meetings being like super awkward, especially like as like a 10 or 11-year-old. You're just going through that really weird sort of stage of life and whatnot. It's like, oh, I'm gonna just awkwardly stand around and see, and the dear old people would like come and shake my hand because like feel sorry for me. And I'm like, yeah. So um, that's fascinating in a sense to be sort of steeped in that. And you seem to have quite a good understanding of like the history of it, and of course you have like these deep roots within it. And maybe this kind of leads into some of what we're going to talk about today. But I think about how maybe what your grand or great grandparents would have like encountered versus like what we see now. And it seems like what they encountered and what this has become are kind of almost like two different things. I don't know if that's an accurate statement, but what would your perspective on that be?
I would have to say I disagree because I think at the heart of this is this sort of two by two. And again, I didn't ever know that com- that comment or that terminology until much later in life. The internet was not a big part of my childhood. Like I did not
Right, right.
I didn't, we didn't have TV, none of those things. So growing up, it's like I went to the library and checked out books. But
Mm-mm.
I feel like the ministry is at the heart of this, and the hierarchy and the sort of purity, the evangelizing of that, and they stay in your homes. You know, I really bought into that hook, line, and sinker. Like, this is the one true way. And,
Right. Yeah.
I'd say probably from like 0 to like 8 or 9, I kind of was like internally like, God, are you talking to me? What's going on? Then I professed, was baptized at 14. And then I would like carry my Bible to school. Right. And the longer the dress, the higher to God, the closer to God kind of, I mean, like I
Yeah.
definitely,
Like carry your Bible to school?
oh
Like,
yeah. I mean, I did the whole thing. I was definitely one of those people who would chastise even internally, like, oh, I can't believe they're wearing like that short of a skirt, or I can't
oh,
believe,
yeah, yeah.
their hair is short. I had never cut my hair. So I had hair down past my knees. Yeah, I mean, if
Wow.
you
It'd be
kind
quite a sight.
of, it was not fun, let me tell you, for a myriad of reasons, but
It seems like it'd be really heavy.
I was terribly happy. Yes. But I also
Yeah.
thought that was the requirement in which to like
Mm-mm.
get to heaven. And this was the only thing I could do to sort of
Yeah, yeah.
live out my values and show the world that I was one of God's chosen people.
Right, because I feel like this kind of emerged at a time where I don't know if like puritanical like beliefs in and around the time that it was coming to fruition were really strong, and then this fellowship really glommed onto those and held onto those, where other religious denominations may have kind of evolved with the times and recognized that okay, maybe we've misinterpreted some of these things or so on, but this fellowship really stuck to those Victorian era kind of ideals, and so I'm still flabbergasted that you like carried your Bible to school. Like,
Well, I mean, I was what you would call like definitely a strange, quiet weirdo. Some of my friends that grew up with me were like, "You're such a strange person." But for me, it was sort of like I felt like that was the requirement, right? That's the standard.
mm,
You have to live up to it, and it was also what was required of by my parents. So
right.
we weren't allowed to wear pants to do things. We weren't allowed to, you know, I guess socialize with the outside world. We weren't allowed to,
Oof.
I mean, you name it. It was like we sort
Yeah,
of
yeah.
held the standard in the community, and we're known to hold the standard. Be like, oh, I like other kids would be like, oh, I look up to you, right? That was kind of like, oh, I look up to you inside the
Yeah,
community.
gosh. And
So,
I'm like hearing the phrase standard bearer, which just historically speaking, for those who might not know, standard isn't just it's actually a reference to like, I believe a person in like a medieval battle formation who would actually carry a flag to indicate like what a formation was to do. So this idea of a standard bearer is actually like someone who carried a flag. But I think with this nebulous idea of the standard, what it is, and yeah, very, very like steeped in, yeah, and especially for women, like again, like my wife and I probably fit into the black sheep category a little bit here, but like I just see, but she was raised fairly strictly as well, like pretty hard line, like. Whereas I think my parents, I felt like they were strict, but now I listen to other people's stories and I realize like they were actually like they picked, like they were strict on some things, but other things they're like, you know what, you're gonna have to figure this one out.
Mm.
And they kind of gave us the latitude to do that, which
Wow.
is really fascinating.
Very
So
interesting.
you had this kind of, yeah, you had this kind of backdrop. And then it's funny because I don't see you as weird at all. Like, that's a funny way to describe yourself. I'm like, you're a fascinating, like super intriguing person. And I think probably a great storyteller. And like there's so many like interesting aspects to that. But at some point in time in your mind, you're going, hang on a sec, all of this that I'm like, because that sounds exhausting to like put all of that into like looking a certain way and like doing all these things. Like I feel exhausted just hearing like you describe everything that was like being put into this. So at some point, something would click in your brain and you go, I don't know about this. How did you feel like the first time like kind of like questions started coming into your mind?
So my piano teacher in high school actually encouraged my parents. She was like, Lauren should apply for a scholarship. And for whatever reason,
Mm.
she convinced my parents that I could apply for a scholarship. I ended up getting the scholarship in Arizona for piano, accompaniment scholarship. And they were like, oh, this is, if you go to college, you're 17. If you go to college, you can do this while you have babies and like get married, or you can become a worker and like play for, I mean, this was the mindset, right? So it was like, okay.
Mm.
And the scholarship required that I lived on campus. So I
Mhm.
felt a compounding pressure, definitely to leave home, but also I had two siblings still at home. So by the time I left at 17, you're still underage. Like, I couldn't, it's like you can't sign for yourself in certain things.
Right,
But
right.
that whole year living with a roommate who actually happened to be this extremely, really, really kind, ginger haired, adorable Christian girl.
Yeah.
And she told me about all of this community service she had done. She would like just embodied all of these things that I thought to myself, I was like, well, this is strange. Like her external doesn't appear anything remote to mine, but like her actual actions and behavior is so different than what I've thought this to be. So there began to be that like reflection up against me. We're sleeping in the same room
Mhm.
and that kind of thing. And she was super kind. So that expanded my worldview. And during that time, somewhere along my freshman year, I started reading a bunch of religious texts and sort of started, I always was a voracious reader. And so I began thinking to myself, like, you know what? I don't want to become a wife or a worker. Like,
Mhm.
this is not,
Yeah, yeah.
this is not for me. Like, I'm not that person. Please no. So that for me felt like a real descent from what I was supposed to do. And so by the time I got home on Christmas break, my freshman year, I was still 17. My mom was like, there's something wrong with you. Your spirit is gone. Like, and I still appeared the same way. I mean, the whole 9 yards. So they could tell something was evolving within me, even though I wasn't verbally saying it. Right.
Mhm.
By the time I got home in the summer after I turned 18 and was home for a couple of weeks, that was sort of began for me. I started reading this book, which I know is probably a little conflicting, but Stephen Hassan, he wrote, it's something about combating cult mind control, right?
Okay,
I
yeah.
don't know why I picked this book up. I don't even know like what brought me to this book or what happened, but I found it at a secondhand bookstore and I recognized elements of control and mindset that I had within myself.
Mhm.
So, even when I'd be learning a Mozart piece or something, I'd be like, okay, well, I have a hymn stuck in my head. Like, why is that?
Yeah, yeah.
Just like sort of obsession versus like, what I'm wanting to focus on, all these different things. So I started
Mhm.
putting these pieces together and that book became like a constant companion for me. And through that
Mhm.
experience, by the end of the summer, I had told my family, like, I am not really sure. I don't really want to do this. And by the fall of my sophomore year, I was like, I'm not going to meetings anymore. And it did not go over well. Let's just say that. I mean, for them,
Right,
for
yeah.
them, and especially like in terms of the family in which I grew up in, is like if you leave the community, right? It's like it's blasphemous. It's worse than an infidel, right? Like you have turned down the only way to heaven.
To sort of illustrate, I think, how difficult it is, like, everybody now looks at you differently because you are breaking free from the one true way, and now you're bound for hell. But not only that, you might be a nefarious influence that could take other people away from this. Did you experience any kind of, like, shunning in that capacity?
So I did. So one of the things that my parents did was take my photos off the wall, and they were like, "We're not going to let your siblings see you," which was really, really painful for me
Whoa.
because I was very close to both of them. But that for me was a way also that sort of like helped break free slightly because there was such extreme shunning. The workers actually
Mhm.
held the workers held a meeting. Jay Wicks and Mike Summers held a meeting, a young people's meeting for the doubting, like people that were troubled about their faith. It was directly for me. Like my parents actually had asked
Like
for them
actually
to
an
have it.
intervention, basically.
So they showed up and it was like a young people's meeting in a basement. Very awkward. My sister was there. She was mortified because she's like, oh my goodness, like we all know what's going on. We all know this is about Lauren. Why is she causing
Right.
a scene? And I brought a list of questions like that I had written down, and
Mhm.
they just kept being like, oh, you have to have faith, this is God's way, you know, all of this sort of thing. And by the end of it, that was like the last big public event that I went to in
Mhm.
my teens, because I was just like, I'm done, I'm out of here. And I lost when I actually left the community, I lost all of my friends. I even had friends write me letters and emails saying like, I actually have zero desire to be your friend because the devil's gotten you, and like, you know, you have a bad spirit. And so I really experienced more of like that heightened fall. And again, you know, at the time at the time it was very, and even going through it in the moment, it's just like very, very internally painful because of the isolation, right? Is that
Mm.
you communally lose that. It's such a conditional experience. And again, like, you know, people have vast experiences through this, but like if your family is more looked at, or at least the way it was, you know, 18 years ago, it was very much like, oh my goodness, what have you done? You know? And from that, it kind of in a way set me free also so that I could just
Yeah.
explore the world from there.
Yeah, fair enough. That's quite a fascinating backdrop. And thank you for sharing all of that. I think it's for me, you know, as you know, I'm still a part of the fellowship, and it's super interesting to hear what other people's experiences are. Like some people listening, you might have heard me like audibly gasp sometimes as I'm listening to your experience because I'm like, wow, that feels like really extreme. You know, like far beyond sort of the level of strictness that I experienced. And I felt like I said, my upbringing was fairly reasonably strict. But now I'm like, oh wow, it was probably not nearly as strict as I imagined when I'm listening to what other people are describing here. And so it like in the term cult kind of gets thrown around, and I know for a lot of people inside the fellowship, it's really like offensive to hear that word. But I think partly because people don't like the thought of like, am I a part of it? Like, have I been like mind controlled, or have I somehow been manipulated, or things like that? And so to then start going down that road and looking at, well, there are aspects of it that are kind of troubling, like this idea of you mentioned the word like spirit or spirit letter, your spirit is wrong, and things like that. And it's kind of this nebulous, sometimes it feels like this nebulous thing that's hard to pin down when somebody would say that to you, and it's really unsettling. Or maybe it
Mhm.
was in your experience, like really unsettling, like, oh,
Yeah.
you have like a wrong spirit. And you're like, what? I'm just trying to figure stuff out because, and I'm not even sure where you stand in terms of belief in God or not. But I think to myself, like, God's not actually afraid of our questions.
Mhm.
Why would we be afraid to ask questions? Like, hey, I don't understand this, and this doesn't seem like this lines up with what I read in the Bible or things like that. Like, why would we ever be afraid to ask questions? But it sounds like this was like you really got answers that were to say unsatisfying is like the understatement of the year. So now you go on this journey and you're like, okay, I'm going to spread my wings, going to fly, do my thing. I'm like, side note, I'm like, man, it'd be cool to listen to you play sometime. Like, do you have a favorite? Total side note, do you have a favorite like classical piece that you enjoy playing?
Rachmaninoff is my favorite. So that would be like that's probably my favorite composer to
Okay,
date, you know.
could
Yeah.
I ask? And this is a bit of a side note. We'll come back to the main topic, but now I'm just curious. What is it about Rachmaninoff? Because people often think like Beethoven was the greatest, and there's Mozart. Maybe some people, very people, maybe even know like Brahms or Joseph Haydn, who I thought was really
Right.
interesting. He had one called Surprise that I really liked. But what is it about Rachmaninoff's work that you enjoy the most?
One, he had rather large hands, and I have very big hands, so that
Okay.
like those large reaches are impressive. And also, there's like some sort of like Russian pessimism, the era in which he was like from. I don't know. There's something about like the melancholy and the immensity and magnitude of the emotions that he's able to portray. I mean, of course, like there's Chopin, there's so many other great ones, but Rachmaninoff for me was always like the place where I could put things that I couldn't verbalize as a child.
Yeah.
Or teen, I guess, rather. Yeah.
Yeah, no kidding. That's really beautiful. I actually think like that's kind of the connection you made to the music. I certainly have an affinity for music, because may have slipped out here as well. Music is amazing because it is a way to put like sound or expression to something we may not have the words to do. So to feel it like that, I have like piano fingers, I would call them. So
that's amazing. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, celebrate and kind of enjoy that. So now you have the scholarship and you're able to kind of explore. Did you do any like performing or things like that, or once you were kind of free from under sort of this control, where did your life kind of take you?
I'm not sure this is going to be great for your podcast, but yeah, there's all sorts of. I feel like I've lived like 100 lives between. I don't know. So let's see. Being on my own, being on scholarship for piano is pretty arduous and long and exhausting, and like it's not glamorous. And so I worked many odd jobs for college, and by my junior year I was like, I can't sustain. So one of my friends had the bright idea for me to be a stripper.
Okay.
So I spent my junior and part of my senior year of college doing that at night.
Okay.
And that was actually where I learned the most about performing, which was like a wild experience. And through that process, like cutting my hair, doing all these things. And then by my senior year, my sister and I both got pregnant. Like I kept mine hidden and my sister kept hers, was public about hers. And so I was very secretive about that. I didn't tell anyone, and had the baby and gave him up for adoption. So there's my at the other part of the journey, and sort of tried from 21 to probably like 28, really tried to repair like this massive rupture that I had with my family, of just like trying to like reconnect. Yes, I'm outside, but I want to make it work. Yes, I'm outside and I want your love, like that constant primal need and whatnot. Yeah.
So, and as you're trying to repair this, and would it be presumptuous of me to say like it probably didn't go as you had hoped?
Well, I think there were definitely moments where there were constant attempts, or like it would feel like, okay, maybe this is working, but there was always this undercurrent of so much of the other like childhood abuse and things that had gone on. So that was unspoken. And so me and my siblings, it was really complicated in so many different ways. But I feel like that for most of my 20s, it was like a little bit of like a regression, is like, I just wanted that approval and love from them so badly. Like I would constantly show up at Christmas and be like, hey, I brought gifts for everyone. And like, let me, let me overdo it and try and make up for the lack, that this big divide that's between us, which is like this religious and sort of moral barrier. Yeah.
And at that point, what are your view? I mean, obviously your views around spirituality were evolving, but I guess if I could ask, like, kind of where did that take you at that point? Like, did you still identify as a Christian? Did you still believe in God, or were you kind of like putting all of that aside?
Well, for me, so much of my psyche was developed and sort of under the dictatorship of this idea of like a white male God who's oppressive and abusive. So like getting out of that from my teens was more of like, I want nothing to do with any religion. I admire people who find solace in that, but I'd really only found a lot of suffering and a lot of shame, a lot of negative underbelly kind of emotions that kept me locked in, which again, at the time I didn't know were also part of like PTSD and whatnot. But it was like that underbelly was really the interior culture of like my childhood, and like this being like some white dude is watching me, not just like my parents. It's just like, oh, this oppressive character. So when I got to college, started reading all these texts, I sort of more for a while was just like, ambivalent, open, like people can do what they want. I can, I can see all the different perspectives, and yet I don't feel like I necessarily, I don't prescribe to the whole like white God in the sky kind of idea, right? Like it just doesn't work for me.
Yeah, yeah.
You might want to edit that part out
Not
for
at all.
your listeners, but
This
I
shouldn't hurt anybody's feelings to hear any of these things, right? We should be free to have these conversations.
But I think that, in terms of belief or a higher power or whatever, it's like I've always found through art, through humanity, through the medium of like communication in particular ways, nature, right, is another one, where there is something much greater outside of ourselves. And also we have the potential internally to do really a lot of great things, right? So I believe in humanity at its core. And that also is an Achilles heel for me, right? Is because I can just be like, oh, look at all this other stuff and not the not the black and the white part of it. So I spent a lot of my 20s just kind of like staying in that area of things. I explored Buddhism for a while. I've done like years and years of meditation practice. So I mean, I've kind of dabbled, but never, aside from stepping into churches, like when I'm on a, walking in Paris or something, I have no desire to, belong to something.
Kind of along the way, this is interspersed with your own kind of personal healing journey as well. So there's other sort of complex sort of mitigating factors that you're trying to navigate. And thank you for sharing your backstory. I'm like, man, there's a lot of fascinating things I would love to explore. That'd be super fun. But so we'll shift gears kind of a little bit here, because at some point in time, this led to you crossing paths with Sherry. And Sherry, who is, you can hear in the episode 1 of this series here, she was interviewed and she shares her story, and your path crossed with hers. How did that come about, where you and Sherry encountered and started having a conversation?
Yeah. So in 2019, my sister, I had temporary, like sort of not guardianship, but some sort of like temporary non-court appointed custody of her children for several months. And so she brought me a letter, and the letter was a redacted form of Sherry's letter that she had written about my father. And so that was a big shock, because I was like, well, how do you know this is him? Who is this person? She's like, I don't know. I just know this is him because of the song that's mentioned in there is one of the songs that he used on Us, which also is not like a core memory for me. So that was also particularly like strange. And so I spent the following like 5-6 months sort of scouring the internet. I'm not really a social media fan, but I did that whole rabbit hole thing, and I found her. And then it was one of the most pivotal phone calls of my life, is realizing like, oh wow, this person is a survivor of Steve, my father, and that everyone had known, aunts, uncles, workers, elder, like everyone had known in the community growing up, and no one had told me or mentioned it. And that was, I think that there's still moments like I've come to terms with it, but it was definitely a big shock to receive.
Yeah, no kidding.
In terms of like, oh, I'm like, and I'm like 30 years old, and what is going on? Like,
who is this person?
You know what I mean? Having a reflection and a story outside of your own experience is it's utterly bizarre to be like, oh, this is not, it's just very, very surreal.
Right. To even like come to terms with the realization that this individual who has been loomed large in your life as a figure, that there's this other aspect to this individual that you were to some degree unaware of, which is, that in itself is like a big thing to process. And so you end up having this conversation with Sherry about this experience, and that kind of leads into the, almost like you're now, maybe whether you wanted to or not, like getting a reconnection to the fellowship that you had kind of like maybe put behind you, and in the weirdest or most difficult kind of terms.
Yeah. It's strange because throughout my 20s, I maybe had contact with like one or two people I had grown up with. One fellow in particular, he had left the community, but for the most part, like I don't have any sustained relationships from the community. I lost a lot of contact, and when I'd see relatives at events or or, family gatherings. If I were to be invited, it'd be like, oh, wow, look at your hair. Like, oh, you've changed so much, like the whole 9 yards.
Let's go straight to the appearance.
Like buckle up and like go in and just deal with what it is. So then meeting Sherry, or actually talking to her for the first time, and then my sister talking to her as well, really reinforced a lot of the awareness that inside of our like sort of really small existence as children, there was so much that we did not know about. And these layers and layers of stories that had existed that had not been told collectively, right? Like, you think like, okay, I know all the family stories. I know where my family comes from. I know about the Colorado stuff. I know the Fargo, North Dakota stuff. I know, the Montana stories. Like, I know all of those things. And then to not know this big, big piece of your own history. I found out that my mom was actually pregnant with me when she found out about Sherry, and she was, 21 years old. So that gives you perspective. Like, this is her second child. So it was like putting these pieces together was like, oh, wow. Like, my mom was expecting me when she found out all of this news, right? It's just bizarre.
Yeah. And then this is like a hallmark of this fellowship and that's why I've titled this series like The Hidden Truth. Like, there's these layers that like we heard whispers about, there was this thing that happened over there, but we don't talk about that, or this thing that happened over here and we don't talk about that. And then when people learn about it, they're absolutely stunned. The cognitive dissonance that they experience is like, it's incredibly hard to sort of reconcile this stuff. And so as you and Sherry started talking and realizing, obviously you have this common connection, what sort of prompted you to realize, okay, we need to take some action here. Like, there's something that we need to do.
So before I'd actually spoken to Sherry, like reading the letter, I actually had written a letter to all of my family, both maternal and paternal sides, aunts, uncles, cousins, everything, saying like, hey, my father's a pedophile. You guys know this. You've known this. How come no one told me? And like, just letting you know, like, there will be mayhem if this is not dealt with, right? Like, it will be public. Like, I don't even know why. This is very threatening, but I was just like, I was so outraged and livid at that point that no one had spoken of this. And then when I started speaking to each family member slowly, little by little, is that the ostracizing, being cut off, being, the victim shaming and blaming, the sort of like, oh, the way that the narrative towards Sherry was, like the horrible things that were said, it's like that only reinforced the sort of disease, or lack of a better word, of like within this small like family community, right, that I had grown up in. And so I started thinking like, this is bizarre.
Yeah.
So in 2021, I wanted to go meet Sherry, went to Texas, sat out in her barn for several hours. And I was like, look, I know I can't ever make things right, but I want to sit here and hear your story on behalf of all of the people I come from, and apologize if you want to do that. Right. So we sort of allowed this friendship, two women very distinct worlds apart, like flew in from New York, and she's she's like on a cattle ranch, and we're both sitting there, and I'm like, this is utterly bizarre. And yet at the same time,
right.
It feels like, it feels when you meet a fellow survivor that there's a point of recognition, especially when you have the same perpetrators, that was wild to me. It's just to be like, and to hear how many people distinctly knew and how many workers knew, for me was just, I think that was almost more shocking than coming to terms with the other part of it.
And I think that's the part that like has really angered me most about this whole situation, is the absolute secrecy around it, and this sort of this urge to preserve the image of something that's hollow on the inside. It's literally, like, for a scriptural reference, like Jesus talked about a whited sepulcher, like painted white on the outside, you look good, and the inside you're full of dead man's bones. And I'm like, this is what we're talking about here. People are so concerned about the outside looking nice and white and clean, and the inside is there's so much rot, and as you described it, as disease. And so you're meeting Sherry, and I mean, I just love that, because I obviously know some of your backstory that we won't discuss here, but I love that you wanted to sit down with her and say, I want to hear your story. I want so that you can feel heard and validated and in the presence of another human being, because there's something so powerful about having just one person who will say, I believe you, I hear you. It is so powerful.
Well, and I also think that communally, that adequate healing cannot begin unless you have that. And that's that layer of, again, like going back to the complicity piece. When I called my mother before I had talked to Sherry, I said, how could you not tell me this? And she said to me, I'll never forget. She said, what does this have to do with you? Why do you need to know this? Those were her words. And that for me was like, well, I believe the act of telling a story has the power to revolutionize an audience, right? It has the power to anger people, has the power to wake people up. I think that storytelling is one of the most, I mean, it's our primal sort of like basis and right is gathering around a campfire and telling a story, right? It's like, that's what we do as humans.
Before we had like papyrus and ink wells, we had stories. Stories are sticky, right? Like it's literally how historical stuff was passed down generation to generation. It's like in us. We're wired for this as human beings to hear and to receive that. Storytelling is immensely important. When we think about, because we're talking about complicity here, and what do you see about this fellowship that, and maybe this is like a Pandora's box, but like really that leads to such a culture of like complicity, secrecy, and silence?
Well, I think when our shame that we carry around our humanity and our own experiences outweighs our need and desire to connect, then I think it's problematic at its core, right? It's like, if I think that this story could somehow invalidate myself or invalidate others and like cause them to lose out or cause them to go to a lost eternity, it's like, well, there's no higher stakes, right? If you're like, oh yeah, like don't tell that one, right? And then also this act of complicity, like, you look in history and I love this. I love this story. It's actually very commonly known, but the Harriet Tubman, when she left and brought her family out of slavery, half of her family went back halfway through. They were like, actually, we're going to go back to slavery. And that's why they called her Moses, because after that first trip, she was like, no, if you leave with me, you're not going back. And I think that is part of what this whole experience is requiring of the church, is to not go back to what they were and what they did. And being complicit is like, I know these are extreme examples, but it's like, this is how I feel about it with child sex abuse. Is it's like, okay, so maybe you're not the person locking people into, the Holocaust, like in that experience. But if you're the person cleaning the toilets, you're complicit. If you're enabling harm to be caused. So this is the problem, right? Is people are like, well, I'm not doing anything. And it's like, that's exactly what complicity is. It's just, right. It's like complicated, right? So you think like, well, I'm not doing anything, but I tell people, I'm like, if you went to convention this year, that's complicity.
Yeah.
If you gave the workers money, if you are not like boycotting, if you are not reimagining things radically and drastically, if you're not standing up for survivors, if you are not willing to pay the price of what true, for lack of a better word, like repentance or sort of like, reparations looks like, this community, the whole community has to pay this price, not just the perpetrators.
Like, it blows my mind that somebody could identify as like a Christian and want to turn a blind eye to the cries of survivors. And I study behavioral psychology, and so I look at it, and it's like I have this saying that all behavior makes sense, and I kind of start with that lens, and I try to understand, okay, what is it about this institution that is causing people, and we've kind of described it a little bit, to turn a blind eye. And it's this fear that if I acknowledge this, like, one of two things is probably going to happen. One, my salvation could be at risk, and two, like, my sense of identity, like, I listen, go back to like your upbringing, how deeply steeped you were in this. This was like, for lack of a better word, like pounded into your identity as a human being. And then to like break free from that, like for most people, it's something they can't they can't really fathom that. And so like, I would rather bury my head in the sand and wish this didn't exist than face the shattering of the reality I have pictured in my head.
Yeah. And I mean, humans will do anything to avoid suffering, right? Like, that's just part of also this experience, right? Is
Yeah.
like, well, I just want to keep the family together. I just want to, I don't want, I don't
Yeah.
want her to leave him, or I want the family to have holidays together, but at the expense of what, and especially when we're talking child sex abuse, it's like, that is what they put
Mm.
up as a sacrifice in order to keep status quo. And so these stories not being told is like, it's so horrifying because it allows this behavior to continue and continue and to be passed down generation to generation.
You said something really powerful that I wanted to highlight, and you use the term child sacrifice. And I think that's a very, very fitting term, because that is the cost to trying to maintain appearance and keeping this stuff hidden, is more children being harmed. And how could, like, I got a 2-year-old and a 1-month-old, and the thought of somebody harming them, that brings me close to wanting to commit murder. Like, I'm a Christian, but I'd be that close to wanting to kill somebody for hurting my children. That's how strongly I feel about my kids. And so then I take how I feel about those kids and then I hear these stories and I picture somebody doing that to my child. And I think, how could I listen to that, to hear the cries of the survivors and not be outraged? How could I hear that and not be outraged? How could I claim to be a Christian and not be outraged by this? Because I think what we have learned or been brought up in is a distorted version of it. And this is probably like maybe sacrilege for me to say, but like a distorted version of this that has done exactly this, held up this ideal image, while there's this repugnant underbelly of like children's lives being destroyed. And the other part of it is that it's hard for people to grasp. Oh, that happened years ago. And oh boy, when I hear that one, I'm like, I would like to smack you. I won't, but I would like to try to like wake you up to this idea that like that happened years ago. Like, forget about it is one of the most ignorant things you could ever say to a survivor.
Well, and I live in New York City, and yesterday was 9/11, right? And so all of the firehouses around, there are wreaths, people were, in attendance, there were memorials all over the city. It's like that sort of grieving and communal loss and suffering that's brought to the forefront on that day every year is exactly what is needed with this church. And it's not happening. It hasn't happened yet. And that's what's so shocking to me is it's like,
No.
I tell people, I'm like, what if the Twin Towers fell and you just were like, oh, well, you know what? Like, that was years ago. Like, well, okay. It still impacts the body, the psyche. And there are people who have lost their lives because of this that we don't even know about, that we will never know those stories. And there are people being harmed today.
Yeah.
That are not getting help because they won't be able to come forward. Their bodies will not let them feel safe enough to come forward for years, maybe decades.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is like, that's a tragedy, is like, if children are not held at the forefront or like in the center of a community, then what good is the community? It just,
like and I know this is probably in reference to a lot. Jesus saying, like, if you hurt one of these, it's better that a millstone is hanged around your neck than what's actually awaiting. And that's another part that actually like blows my mind, because I'm like, as a Christian who tries to follow the teachings of Jesus, and I think, but this is what he said about harming children, is that the most desirable outcome for you would be that you were basically drowned in the sea with a millstone around your neck. To try to somehow paint a picture of the gravity of what it means to harm a child, it is like the absolute worst thing that could be committed. And so
yeah.
a community that wants to not like won't even acknowledge it because of their desire to maintain a certain appearance. And if people find out about this, I'm like, what do you think happens when people find out, not only find out about this, but the fact that you've been covering this up for years? It's brutal.
Yep.
I wanted to get your take on, or just get you to share a little bit about the trauma triangle. I feel like, again, there's this misunderstanding, like really blatant ignorance, which shouldn't exist at this point. But anyways, there's a blatant ignorance around trauma and how it affects people, and how it affects people for years to come. If you could share just a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, the sort of key pieces, and again, this functions very differently. Some people stay in the roles forever. Some people switch roles. Some people move out of it. But to really break the cycle, you have the perpetrator or the abuser, you have the person who's the victim or the abused, and then you also have the enabler or the complicit person. And without those three, if one person removes themselves from that, then you no longer have that functioning, right, of the movement between the three.
Mm-hmm.
So what I tell people is I'm like, look, if you cannot change the perpetrator, which really can't, right? I mean, it's like next to impossible. They're also charming, sociopaths, good at grooming. I mean, there's all these layers to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you keep the focus off of them and you sort of like look at yourself, you're like, well, am I being complicit in the behavior of a perpetrator? Am I allowing them to come to meetings with me? Am I allowing them to be around children at family gatherings because of my own needs and desires? And I don't want to actually sit and wrestle with things. Like, those are ways you can protect the survivors or the potential survivors, even, is by removing yourself out of that and not enabling that behavior and those crimes.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you shared that in particular, because I think there are people who would like witness the magnitude of this and then just actually basically shut down, because the scale of this is horrifying. Like, it's huge. I believe, and I haven't fully verified these stats, but it's looking something like about 3 times as bad per capita as the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church has been held up as like the pariah of religious institutions for their enabling and cover-ups for decades and decades. And then we think that we're, statistically speaking, like 3 times worse. If that isn't a wake-up call to people, I really don't know what is. But so to the person that's feeling overwhelmed and going, what can I do? This is so huge. This is so like beyond me. I just feel so deeply ashamed, so overwhelmed, and so on, to say to them, you can no longer be complicit. And that's it's not actually a hard thing to do, is to withdraw your support from the system that's enabling this to happen.
Absolutely. I mean, you see it throughout history. People have done this and it's worked. It might take decades, right? It might take centuries, but it is possible. And I think that's the thing that I just don't quite understand in all of this, is it's like, once you know better, do better, right? And no, you maybe can't change the entire thing, but some of these people are smart, educated people that we've talked to, and they still don't get it. And I tell people, I'm like, you don't have to have an education to understand that child sex abuse is crime. Like, it's pretty black and white. Not many things in life are, but this is black and white.
Yeah.
And I don't know where the disconnect is, but again, I come back to this thing. It's like, well, if your salvation is at risk, right? Or you feel that it is at risk, why would you speak up about things?
Right. And so it speaks to just this flawed theology or doctrine or dogma, really, actually, that somehow harming this institution puts your salvation at risk. And that's the tool, because I also look at sort of this hierarchical structure that exists, and I look at that and I go from an organizational psychology standpoint, what is it about how this system operates that also enables perpetrators? And I look at how, like, those who are sociopaths, whatever setting, whether it's a corporation, whether it's a criminal organization, whether it's a religious institution, they tend to rise into positions of authority and influence where they're respected, and they know how to behave within the system to look like the ideal individual within that system. And it's that position of power and authority and influence that allows them to abuse and take advantage of that. Because there's so many people that are still thinking like, oh, most of these overseers are good. And so some people will know that I've been a pretty vocal critic, and in particular of what I'm referring to as the overseer class. I look at like my first communication, which was very, like, I would say, kind-hearted. Like, I speak this out of love, and I'm concerned for all of you. I believe most of you are good, and so on, to the point that I wrote a headline that was like, Lord, be not silent, expose the pedophiles, the rapists, and the cowards who enable them. We went from like one to the other, because as I started to realize the scope and scale of this problem, I was like, the time for like gentle words is long gone. The time for like and so I wanted to use my voice as best I can to at least say something, to not remain silent in the face of this. And so I've been calling out the overseer class in particular because I believe that none of them have a right to even call themselves that anymore. Because if we look statistically speaking, first of all, a disproportionate number of the ministry have been abusers. And then from there, a disproportionate number are male, and maybe that's statistically significant across society as a whole. And then it's a disproportionate number of men who are in positions of authority again. And so we look at where are the majority of these abusers concentrated, and then you have to try to imagine these other ones. We talk about complicity. Somehow they are entirely ignorant that this is taking place when they've literally like moved these people around instead of deal with the problem. And so I imagine because you and the other members of the advocates team here have like, you started this hotline, you started operating within this, and I think like it's like to the shame of the fellowship that there's these people outside of the fellowship who care more about survivors than people inside do. That again, like I want to say it shocks me. It kind of doesn't at this point, but it really like seriously disappoints me that people inside don't care as much as you and Cynthia and Sherry have cared about trying to expose this and fight this. I don't know where this organization goes from here in a sense. I'm curious what your thoughts are as kind of an outside observer watching all this play out.
Yeah, I mean, this is complex, right? In so many ways, because it's like you're looking at people. One, it's not an institution of trust, so it's not suable, right? So there's actually no retribution for survivors, which is awful and that's its own problem. The other thing is if the community is not willing to acknowledge and actually retroactively and then moving forward change all of their policies and systems and hire a third party outside source to keep this hotline going for the next 50 to 100 years or whatever, nothing's going to change. And then also provides support for survivors. It's like, you're just going to have more of the same. It's the repeated cycle over and over and over, which means in order for this community to actually get to the place it needs to get, it means that everyone is going to have to actually sort of implode and also get down to zero and rebuild. Mm-hmm. And that right there is most people don't want to do that work. That's part of this, is that they don't want to do this work. Yeah. Which is like, this is like, wow, what have I done? How am I complicit? What perpetrators have I enabled? I was thinking as you were speaking about Eldon Tenniswood, who was an overseer in California, very beloved by my family, Dan Hilton, another perpetrator, Dallas Linneman. All of these men are pedophiles, right? Overseers, very well-loved workers. It's like, those were the people in my home. And I could go on and on and on. And the other ones knew that my father was a pedophile. So it's like those two things coinciding together, the complicit with the perpetrator, actually makes for such a dangerous system.
Right.
So when we wrote that overseer letter to say like, okay, you guys all need to step down, we knew they weren't going to step down. We're like, of course, they're not going to listen to 3 women who are not a part of their community. Of course they're not. However, we wanted to set the precedence that speaking out and up against the powers that be is actually super, super important in changing that dynamic, changing that power structure, and also waking people up, even if it's for a moment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. Because there would be those who looked at that letter and maybe had high hopes, like, oh, wow, yes. And there's something else sort of coming down the line. But you already knew. And I think like, I would have agreed, like, but these, because we think about sense of identity and these men have been in these positions for years and years and years and worked their whole life to get into these positions, and to step down means for them, like all of this gets left behind. And so I feel as though this won't happen until they get arrested and charged criminally. And the part that kind of frustrates me to some degree is that people will still call them like martyrs.
They'll be followed into prison, or they'll think like, oh, they were sacrificed or what. I mean, there's just so many, like, again, it's easier to believe the lie and the delusion, the mass delusion, than to actually accept the harsh reality of the crimes that have been committed inside this community. It's deplorable and disgusting. I mean, like, working this every day and talking to these survivors and listening to these stories, like, I mean, I don't know. It feels like we've gone to war, and then, people don't understand. But I'm like, if someone could sit on the hotline for a couple of days, like everyone inside the community, they might wake up. But that's not, the survivor shouldn't have to do that. Again, the other part is that survivors shouldn't have to tell their stories repeatedly to wake these people up. It's like the data should be enough.
Yeah.
Like the data should be enough. And the name should be enough, right? Eldon Tenniswood was a pedophile. Like, what are you guys thinking? He was the overseer of California for years and years and years, and beloved. Take your photos of him off the wall. Take them off.
Yeah. Right. I think what we just shared there, if people could, even for 4 hours, sit on the hotline and listen to what people say, how it would change their perspective. Like for me, and part of creating this series is, maybe some survivors will tell their story, that are in a place where they're comfortable sharing their story and speaking publicly about it, can share their story once and then just refer people back to this or something. Say, there's my story. You can go see it there. You can hear it. You can see my facial expressions. You can hear the tone of my voice and so on. And really leave an impression. That's why I wanted to try to capture it in these mediums, survivor stories, because it's just people, it's not sinking in, because written words seem to be not enough for these people. And I'm okay with the whole organization imploding, frankly, because, and which then kind of leads me to ask, I'm curious what you've kind of been on the receiving end as you've been in this fight, which is a good fight, a righteous fight for survivors as an outsider. And how has there been blowback, which I'm sure there probably has been, and sort of what has that been like for you on the other side of this? And how are people on the inside, especially those in positions of authority, treating you?
The first thing I would say is that people either are doing a lot of the black and white, like, you're amazing, you're saving us, or the dichotomy of like, oh, you're the devil, these women are trying to ruin the church, blah, 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 right? So you kind of, after a while, I tell people I'm like immune to both the praise and the discourse and the hatred. It's just kind of like, some days it gets you, and then other days you're just like, okay, it doesn't, it's just one person's opinion, perspective. But the thing that really bothers me the most is like, I was on a call last night for CSA policy changes, right? And a person who was best friends with my parents, my father in particular, he was like, oh, we want all of the survivors to come to us, going forward, and we'll disseminate the information. This man is a lawyer. This man is educated. And, here's the problem, right? It's like, after 6 months of observing and witnessing and experiencing this crisis, and you're an educated person, this is still your takeaway. Like, that to me is disturbing. That to me is distortion. And it's like, how are your own children even safe amongst a community if you're not even willing to say like, hey, actually, no, we should not be the ones doing intake. It should be a third party. Like, that kind of stuff is that's the stuff that makes me upset. I don't care what they say about me. Like,
right.
My own family has been like, oh, Lauren's batshit. Like, she's just insane, like she's like crazy and working the hotline, I mean, it's like, she's trying to ruin our church, like blah, 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 the whole 9 yards. And condemning members of my family to hell, you know what I mean? That are supportive of it, that are even inside. So, I mean, that's the cost, but that cost is nothing compared to like what these children inside are going to go through if people remain the same.
Well, it's funny you use the phrase like what you're doing is condemning people to hell. I'm like, the irony, for lack of a better term, the irony is rich, because I'm like, have you considered the actions of a child rapist? That maybe that's actually what's condemning them to hell? Like, does not sink in. And I know it's kind of like preaching to the choir here, but I just wanted to verbalize it. Like, I'm like, I want it to sink in that these predators are not godly men. They are not Christian men, or women as well, but I mean, it's predominantly men. These predators are not godly. They are not Christian. They're criminals. And it's their own actions that are condemning them. It is not the voice of somebody on the outside fighting for the wounded, bleeding in the ditch, that is trying to tear this institution down. Why the blame would fall on your shoulders as though you have some kind of vendetta, again, boggles my mind, because The reality is you're fighting for the victim that's, I'm saying bleeding in the ditch for those who might not know. It's a reference to the parable of the Good Samaritan. And you're fighting for those. And it's like people are angry at the Good Samaritan and they're not angry at the robbers. They're not angry at the criminals. What will it take for them to finally turn their anger to the criminals and say, you have no place amongst us. You're not welcome in our home. We're not supporting you financially. You've lost all and any authority that you once had because who you really are has been shown. So as we kind of wrap this up, I think, man, there's a lot of questions I'd like to ask, but for the for the sake of time, and I want to say thank you so much for being so generous with your time as well, because I know like it's busy because you also have like a life outside of this.
You used to have a life.
Okay.
Yes.
You used to have a life. I'm like, I wonder if people like stop and remember like, oh wow, these people are human beings with a life. Like, you know, I have 2 kids. I have a wife. I have a business that I run. Like I have all these other things that I'm trying to do, but I feel like, okay, this is one thing that I can do where I can try to elevate the voices of survivors and those who are advocating and fighting for survivors. And even then it feels like it's a really tiny thing, but I'm like, this is something that I can do. I can contribute to this. Anything that can lead to increased awareness of what is happening, you know, can potentially be a catalyst for change. What's the thing that you would like to say to the fence sitters, the ones who have the capacity to maybe change?
I think for those, in order to make this work, in order for the community and survivors to get the help that they need, those people sitting on the fence have to get uncomfortable. They're going to have to reckon with all of this, and they're going to have to get into the arena. And that's what's honestly keeping them back. It's like there's no personal cost for these people, right? And that's what you see, that apathy. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, it doesn't affect me, right? Historically, you can look at all of these things in history. It's like, well, yes, I see the photos, but it doesn't affect me. It has nothing to do with me. And that's really what we're seeing here again, is like communally is like, oh yes, and like, you know, there's no perpetrators in our family. Oh yes, and like, you know, we don't, you know, our kids, we asked our kids.
That you know about.
Yeah, we asked our kids if they were sexually abused, and they said no. And I'm like, well, that doesn't mean that they weren't abused. Like, that's the thing, is in order to have these conversations, it's not a one and done deal. It's not like, oh yeah, you take the perpetrator out of meeting. It's like these overseers, these workers, these friends are still saying that, you know, child rapists have the spirit of a lamb. You know, I tell people, I'm like, my father has a garden. My parents bake casseroles for people. Like, that's also the profile of pedophiles, right? Like, it doesn't appear the way you think it does. Like, abuse does not look the way you think it does. So get over that. Survivors are not going to look all the same. They're not all going to be able to articulate or speak the same or sound the same. Like, that is also part of this. And no survivor owes you their story. If anything, the biggest thing that could help is these people that are complicit, which really is the entire community at this point. And I really feel this way. It's like everyone who remains and does nothing is complicit, and they have blood on their hands. So do something. Get messy, you know, offend people, you know, get people angry, stir them up, like cause some good trouble. You know, it's like, this is what you're supposed to be doing. Mm-hmm. Go flip over some tables.
Yeah. They should be able to get that reference.
Hopefully.
Well,
yes.
Lauren, really, really appreciate your time today. I appreciate more than that, the work you're doing. And I just want to acknowledge that.
I will say this, though, is that it's not about us. Like, it stopped. People have said this, like, oh, maybe it's about your case or Sherry's case. And I tell them, like, it stopped being about us.
Yeah.
The day the hotline went up.
Mm-hmm.
This is collectively is like, this is just so, there's thousands of stories. Like, it's not about me. It's not about Sherry. It's not about our cases, our stories. It's like, there are thousands of survivors that need help. And each person in the community is responsible to those survivors, whether or not they're in the community or not. Mm-hmm. They are responsible. Mm-hmm. They owe them the casseroles and love and envelopes underneath the door and under the pillow and like the gas money. That's who's owed this. Mm-hmm. So do the right thing.
I love that. That's a great note to finish on. Thank you. Even though we're talking about a hard topic, it's genuinely been a pleasure chatting with you about this. And thank you for being so open with what you shared as well.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into The Hidden Truth. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share this episode because that helps this podcast to reach and inspire more people. It is so important these stories are heard so that we continue to raise awareness and support victim survivors on their healing journey. For those who've been affected but haven't found your voice yet, I really hope these stories inspire you to keep moving forward on your healing journey. Thank you.